day, everybody, and thank you for coming to this first lecture on Christian theology and popular culture. Today we're going to be talking about the erosion of authority. And we're going to do that by looking at another culture from ours to see another perspective on power and authority in the life of society, the church, and the individual. It's very helpful for us to understand that our culture, the Western culture, and especially here in Southern California, is not the only culture in the world. And I bring up a book that I read for my graduate studies. It was written by a Protestant missionary from England who went to England. His name was Leslie Newbigin. And he graduated from Cambridge University in the 1930s. Then right after graduation, him and his family moved out to South India for almost 40 years. And then very interestingly, when he moved back to England and retired, he began writing these great books about Western culture, critiquing Western popular culture. And that's because he had been outside the culture for so long, he was able to gain a perspective. And so one of his great books that he wrote is called The Gospel in Pluralistic Society. And so we're going to go back to another culture of 500-600 years ago and find out what it can teach us about power and authority and how it is eroded over time. So the culture we're going to be looking at is the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, you had the great cathedral of medieval authority. And this, all authority basically, all learning basically was in the church, the medieval church. They had all authority, not only among the common people, but even in the political. The Pope and the church had control over who was going to be emperor, who was going to be king, and everyone was under the umbrella of the church as far as authority was concerned. The church had all learning, it had all the books. There were very few books in number, and they were all held by the church. And only if you were a learned church person and read Latin could you read the books. Also, in a loose sort of way, the Bible was also part of that authority structure. But the Bible was also blended with Greek philosophy and the tradition of the church. And so this all added up to basically there was only one worldview in the society. There were no other worldviews. It was a hierarchy of place. If you were a serf, if you were someone's servant, you would probably be born on that land, you would work on that land, and you would die on that land. There was no climbing the social ladder, so to speak. Everyone knew their place in the society. Everything was set. You knew who was over you, and that person almost had absolute control of who you were and what you were going to do. Now, that cathedral of medieval authority began to be dismantled about 500 years ago in the 1500s, 1600s. And let me tell you three ways in which this authority began to be eroded. First of all, there was the science. Science began to blossom in the 1700s. And one of the early scientific discoveries is that countered the medieval worldview. In the medieval worldview, it was felt that the universe revolved around the earth. The sun revolved around the earth. According to Copernicus and Galileo, their observations, they gave their heretical viewpoint that it was the opposite. The earth revolved around the sun. And so because people had believed for so long, and the church had taught for so long, that it was an earth-centric universe, when science began to discover the truth about the universe, the church and its authority and the Bible in connection with the church began to be eroded in people's eyes. Another way the Bible was eroded is that it was taught for thousands of years. And by the way, what I believe is that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, including Genesis, when he was alive in the 1400 years before Christ was born, around 1400 BC. Um, it began to be understood in German scholasticism in about the 1700s that the Bible was not an inspired book. It had been put together, it was a Jewish folk book, and that it had been gathered together through various authors. It's called the documentary hypothesis. And so the inspiration of the Bible was called into question, and basically over 100 years, it fell from the understanding that it was an inspired book to one, it was basically a collection of folk stories by local Jewish or either an oral or a written tradition. Another thing that eroded the authority of the Bible was the anthropological. They began to discover that there was other creation stories and flood stories in the ancient Near East. And so they felt, well, the creation story in the Bible, where God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, the flood story, well, this was just one flood story and creation story among many. Other ancient cultures had flood stories. Other ancient cultures had creation stories. So the Bible was just seen as one among many. And what basically happened is that the Bible, which used to hold authority in the society as an inspired book, as a place of authority and absolute truth, began to erode to a place of relativism, of pluralism. The Bible is just one book among many. We have many holy books. We have one. We have the one from the Hindus, and we have books from the Buddhists. We have books from the Muslims. We have other holy books from the Chinese. These other ancient cultures, and they were all basically put on the same level. A book that is an ancient book that holds equal authority with these other books. And in place of this vacuum left by the Bible, science basically ascended to where, if you wanted to know about absolute truth, you consulted science. And so science, if you ask science, when does ice freeze? Well, we know it's 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius. If you want to know absolute truth, you go to science. Relative truth, it may or may not be truthful. It's a help maybe to guide your life. Then you go to the Bible. But absolute truth is where science now holds the ascendancy, especially in Western society. Now, it's very important for us that we look at other truth structures. And today we looked at the Middle Ages, and we also looked at our current cultural structure, which is pluralism. And I like what Mark Twain wrote. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. I think that was written over 100 years ago, and I think how true that is today. And so what I'd like us to do is think a little bit about the current culture you were brought up in. Maybe you weren't brought up in this country. Maybe you weren't brought up in Southern California. Southern California is a distinct culture. I grew up in Northern California above San Francisco. And let me tell you, when I moved 500 miles south to Southern California, it was a totally different culture. So even within a state, you have different cultures. And so you might not have grown up here in Southern California. Maybe you moved from another part of the country or another country. And so I want you to think about how that travel has affected your worldview. And so the assignment today is this. Please comment on Mark Twain's observation above about the benefit of travel and the broadening of your cultural perspective. And I want you to think about something. Would Black lives and other lives matter more if we would get better acquainted with their lives, talent, and struggles? Recently we've had these very unfortunate, fatal murders put on video and recorded of black people. And so we want to gain a perspective. Our worldview, our culture is not the only worldview out there. And so we want to gain a perspective not only of our own culture, but of other people's cultures to make us more tolerant, to help us grow in our own cultural understanding. And then we will want to see how the Bible might interface with making some decisions, especially as young people. What am I going to do with my life? Who am I going to get married to? How am I going to spend my leisure time, etc.? And so we're going to be dealing with those issues in future lectures. I might mention about next week's lecture, the rise of individualism. And this is one of the major findings of my doctoral dissertation. We're going to talk about individualism and how this was a very unique perspective. Remember, in the Middle Ages, there was only one worldview, and the authority resided in the church. It resided outside of myself. In individualism, the authority is in me. And from very early on in life, especially in Western society, we'll see that there is this sense of self, and this self is where authority resides. And that has both positive and, of course, it can also have, as all cultures, can also have a negative influence on a person's life. Well, I know this has only been a very short introduction into this particular topic. I hope you're able to read some of the other material I'm leaving you for this lecture, and I hope that I'll meet you on the forums and also interact with the paper you write about this first week of the lesson. God bless, and hope that we will meet each other during the week.